every one of our listeners, everyone listen to this, can grow your practice $100,000 a year in collections, $100,000 a year with the same team and the same hours. Same team, same hours. And why can I say that so confidently, Naren? Because I've literally helped hundreds of clients do that. And if it's been done before, it must be possible. So you can grow 100. So if you don't believe that, I'm going to ask you to take a leap in faith with me and just assume you could grow your practice $100,000 a year in collections, same team, same hours. Well, now let's look at the economics of growth. And real quick, in terms of economics, we've got fixed expenses and variable expenses. Fixed expenses are those that stay the same no matter what. No matter how much dentistry you do, that expense stays the same. For example, rent or mortgage would be an example of a fixed expense because it's not related to your production. Variable expenses are those expenses that will increase as you do more dentistry. Most of the expenses in dentistry are fixed. They stay the same no matter what. However, there's a couple of notable exceptions, and they're variable expenses, meaning that the more dentistry you do, the more that expense goes up. The first of those is lab, if you use an outside lab. And I use a budget of 8% or less for using an outside lab. And when I use a percentage, the percentage is a percent of revenue, not a percent of expense, percent of revenue. So 8% or less. And if you're a CERAC office or a CAD/CAM office, then you're still going to have a lab expense, but the lab expense is likely to be lower. And that lab expense, if you're CERAC, is 4% or less, my budget for that. But let's use the 8% because it's higher. So 8% now, as you do more dentistry, your lab bill goes up 8%. The other expense that increases as a function of the dentistry you're doing is your consumable supplies. Well, the budget I have for consumable supplies is 6% or less. And again, we do more dentistry, we're going to use more supplies. So take the 8% for lab, add it to the 6% for consumable supplies. Theoretically, our overhead in the next $100,000 is only 14%. 8 plus 6 is 14. But Naren, we all know that other expenses seem to creep up. I'm not quite sure how they do that, but they creep up. And so I'm going to put in another 6% for what I'm just going to call a broad miscellaneous category of expenses that creep up. Another 6% on that. So it gives me a round number. 8% for lab, 6% for consumable supplies, 6% for miscellaneous. Add that up, and I've got 20% overhead on the top $100,000 if we can do that with the same team and the same hours. Is that making sense, Aaron? You follow along?
Absolutely, Gary. It makes sense. So what you're saying is we don't need to necessarily increase, expenses. We don't need to, buy some technology or do some magical thing. You can literally set this goal of how do I use what I have to produce a little bit more. And if you do this 100,000 at a time, before you know it, you can easily increase your, drop your overhead because your revenue is larger, but your expenses are not going up.
Well, and now let's look at, the finish line. Let's look at what that looks like. So remember we said the average practice overhead, according to the ADA, is a little bit over 650,000. Let's just round that up to 700. Because I like to think that any of our listeners are not average, they're above average. So let's use that to 700. Okay. And I have to use an example to get very granular here. If you have a $700,000 practice before the growth in collections, and your overhead is 74%, which is what the ADA says your overhead is, then your net income on that practice, so that would be 26% of 700,000 is $182,000 a year, 182 a year. Naren, you follow along? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense.
182 is not a bad income when you compare yourself to the public, but I personally think every dentist should have a higher income than that. You deserve better than that. That's a middle class income. And if you have high student loans and that sort of thing, it's going to be hard to get ahead, with that. So let's look at what happens when you take that $700,000 practice and it becomes an $800,000 practice. What's the overhead on those top $100,000? What percent? 20%.
20%, yes.
So now you keep another $80,000 in net income on that top $100,000.
Right.
So let's add 80 to the 182. You made 182 on the first 700. You make 80 on the next 100. And we're now at 262. Hey, that puts us in a different zip code, doesn't it, Naren?
Yeah, I mean,
now your overhead, if you do the math on that, is 66%. So our overhead went down from 74 to 66. Because now on $800,000, same team, same hours, you now have pre-tax income of 262, much better than the 182. And any of our clients can do that. Now, I want to get to 60%. So I want to do it one more time. So let's now take that $800,000 practice and grow it another $100,000 to a $900,000 practice. And again, I'm assuming we can do this with the same team, same hours, and look at the result. On the next 100, Naren, what's our increased income on the next 100? The increased net income.
And another 80,000.
Another 80,000. So take 262, add 80. We're now at 342,000. Remember, we started at 182. We're now at 340. I think we can all agree that you're in a much better financial situation at 342,000 in annual income than you were at 182. And by the way, do the math now on that and guess where your overhead is at that point. It's at 60%. At 60%. So your overhead went from 74% to 60% by growing